"614 Startups Nation, welcome back to Ask an Expert. Today, I have our legal contributor, Demetrius Robinson of KJK, with us to discuss the top legal mistakes startup founders make. All right, Demetrius, we're now on to mistake number 4. And I know this is one that gets you excited. Tax law considerations. Where do founders go wrong?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, this is my favorite topic, right? Traditionally, I'm a tax attorney. That's what I put myself out the world as. I also have an LLM in tax, and so this is sort of my bread and butter of this space, is understanding sort of tax implications for founders and obviously other businesses as well. But I think the mistake here is. And I've had it actually really recently with a client that we're working through with the IRS, is the money comes in and you sort of just are rolling, and you're not really thinking about the implications of, I'm making money, eventually I have to pay someone back for it, but let's just roll until something happens. And there's unfortunately cases across the globe, probably, but definitely in the United States and in the news of individuals who have made those mistakes. Even some very famous individuals who have not necessarily taken all the steps they needed to satisfy their tax obligations. So let's sort of break down some of the important aspects and how to avoid sort of making those mistakes as a founder. So the first is knowing that for every dollar you make, there's a tax implication. Now, there's a way to avoid those taxes, but there is not a way usually to avoid reporting those taxes, right? So if I make $1, but it costs me $1 to make that dollar, I still file a tax return in theory, not necessarily for $1, so don't quote me on that. But that dollar that's made, that's a tax implication. Now the tax likely will be zero because obviously there is an expense associated with creation of that dollar. But there's still potentially a reporting requirement for that. Even more so, if that dollar is being created to an employee who made that dollar, then that not only is there what's called income tax potentially to that $1, but there are employment-related taxes, and also known as sort of payroll taxes. And so, as a founder who hires employees, I need to understand sort of the implications of that, right? Because once I have an employee, I have some additional obligations beyond, just making money, because I need to now pay money, not just to the government, but I need to pay money to the government on behalf of my employee. That's what's called withholding. And so if I don't do that, not only does the government sort of frown on that, but they can come after you personally if you control the purse strings or making decisions about how the money is supposed to be allocated. Not only can they come sort of civilly to say, hey, you need to pay that money that you didn't withhold, but if it's so egregious, they can come after you criminally as well. So that's definitely something. Payroll taxes is not something you want to play with. Payroll taxes usually include what's called FICA, which is sort of your, we call it like a 15% or so rate, but the employer pays half and then the employee pays half. And then that gets remitted based on a certain schedule the IRS has outlined, based on how much money you're making or you're intending to make, and then how much money, how many employees you have, and so forth and so on. So there's a schedule that's out there. There's a number of organizations that can help you with those payroll sort of expenses, but that's like the number one problem that I sometimes have with clients that I'm helping to address, is that they neglected their payroll tax obligations. And because of that, now there's implications long term. So definitely don't get that wrong. Income tax you can get wrong-ish, but payroll tax, no, definitely not. The next one is sort of thinking about is sort of those other ancillary taxes, right? So depending on what jurisdiction you're in, meaning what state or municipality that you're operating in, can have its own taxes, whether it's income tax, whether it's what's called franchise tax, or Ohio, we call it commercial activity tax. There's potentially other tax obligations that your business now is going to be obligated to either withhold or remit, meaning you got to send the government some money. And so you want to understand what those are and what jurisdictions you're operating in, because each of them may have a different obligation. And if you're not sort of understanding that, then you can potentially end up with a liability that you didn't anticipate, which is not sort of what you want. Sometimes I found with founders is, you hire, especially in this remote world, you hire someone in a new jurisdiction. They're working remotely in Colorado. You're operating out of Ohio. Well, now that you're operating out of Colorado, you actually may have tax obligations to the state of Colorado. And actually, even locally in certain jurisdictions, actually in Colorado, there's some local income tax requirements as well. So you just want to understand that, because as long as you know it, you can plan for it, you can appropriately budget for it, you can take the steps to appropriately address it. The next one I think that I think about from a tax perspective is, and kind of going back to another topic we talked about, is incentive compensation. So you're usually incentivizing your employees a certain way, whether it's for performance individually or collectively as a group. And so you're using, restricted stock or stock options or phantom income or some variation of those. Each of those sort of have implications not only on the company itself, but on the individual. And so you want to sort of plan for that, because if, for example, you've chosen a method that has some significant tax implications to your employee, but you're a privately held company, and so they can't sell their stock, and so they don't actually have the income available to them to pay the tax on that. That can be detrimental to them individually, and they may not want to work for you anymore because you're not sort of looking out for them. And so you just want to make sure that you're planning for those sort of situations. The other piece I think is an advantage for founders, is not talked about a lot, is there's a provision under the tax code, section 1202, that allows companies in certain industries that are small, so it's called qualified small business stock, that when they exit at some time in the future, under the rules, it's kind of 5 years or so, then potentially they have the opportunity to not be taxed on any of the proceeds of that exit. I bring this up because it is, when we talk about mistake number 2 in organizational structure, is if you did not sort of structure the organization the very beginning correctly, then that can impact your ability to take advantage of something like USPS, or take advantage of certain incentive compensation plans, right? So those are kind of how all those mistakes sort of compound, that if you've made one of them, they could then impact another mistake and sort of continue to trickle downhill. So just something to think about there. I think the last one, as it relates to tax, and I know I could talk forever about tax and various aspects of it, but I don't want to take all of your time sort of talking about tax, is thinking about employee classification. So traditionally, we think about employee classification only on the employment law side, and there are implications there for sure as well. But there are other implications on the tax side of how you're classifying your employees. So you asked the question, what is employee classification? And employee classification is understanding whether or not an individual is in fact an employee, meaning they work for you, meaning they've met either the Department of Labor or the Department of Taxation sort of test, I guess you would call them, for how an individual should be determined. I see it a lot of times in the very beginning of companies that everyone just classifies people that are working for them as independent contractors. They do that because you avoid having to withhold employment taxes, having to deal with HR related issues, so forth and so on. So some people think it's easier that way, and no one's going to find out. And that may be true. No one will. You may be perfectly fine doing so. But if you have not appropriately sort of made sure that individual should be a non-employee, then if the situation goes downhill and that employee decides that, or non-employee decides that they should have been an employee, they can do whistleblower-ish action against you with the appropriate agency. And then that agency starts opening your books and records to determine whether or not only should that individual potentially be employed with you, and you should have taken steps there, but maybe others. And so that's just something you want to avoid because it could have significant financial implications for your organization. So make sure that you understand what those tests are, how to meet the test, how to avoid the test if necessary, if you want them to be classified a certain way. And then obviously talk to a professional about making sure you're doing the right things there.
Yeah, and so Demetrius, again, thank you. So much value, so many insights gleaned from your years of experience working with clients. If you listen to that, and if at any moment you raised an eyebrow, because one of those things is happening in your company, do not ignore it. Tax issues don't get better by ignoring them. So if you have a specific concern and you need somebody who's an expert to walk you through it, reach out to Demetrius Robinson of KJK. All right, folks, we're going to just keep answering your question. So stay tuned for the next episode of Ask an Expert. That's a wrap, folks. You can find this and all our episodes on our website, 614startups.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, and all your favorite podcasting platforms. Don't forget to subscribe and write a review. If you'd like updates sent directly to your inbox, you can sign up for our weekly newsletter on the website. To engage in the 614 Startups community, follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at 614 Startups on all platforms and join the conversation. For sponsorship opportunities and collaborations, email us at info@614startups.com.